I'm kind of thrilled that we've got Simon and Dan this evening, because they are two of the great powerhouses, really, of family and local history, and they have published widely, a prodigious amount of publication in those fields and in genealogy, including books on go onto Amazon, or go somewhere that you buy books and look them up, and then you'll see that they've done stuff on the Oddfellows, on workhouses, on the First World War, military history, breweries, and the history of the Open University as well. So they are really two gentlemen who are kind of at the top of their game, really. Simon is a long-standing genealogist, local historian, archivist, and is now embarking on a PhD at Leicester University under Rowie Sweet, and some of you know Rowie. On I think is it on the history of tourism? Is that right, Simon? Yeah, that's right. So that's probably going to be another 6 or 7 books going to be shot out of the gun barrel there. And Dan is a former lecturer at the Open University, who is now retired. I'm very envious of the fact that he's now retired, but he's also the official historian of the Open University, and has written a book on the history of that particular august institution, should you wish to check that out. So we are very, very pleased to have those two chaps on board. And but for this evening, at least, I understand that they are also both amazing doyens of toilet humour. That's what they're going to entertain us with now. I am going to be quiet, unusually, and I'm going to hand it over to Simon and Dan, who are going to hit us with their history of London's public conveniences and the assorted goings on therein.
What we're going to be talking about tonight is really two combined talks, really, where I'm going to be talking really about the 1960s. Dan will be talking about up to the 1960s, really, and then we finish with a bit about the contemporary history and the problems that anybody wishing to use toilets in Britain today face. So you do want anything to add anything, Dan? You can tell this has been rehearsed with an inch of its life.
No, that seems fine. I think what we're going to do is, I say, Simon's going to outline the situation in the 1960s, when studies revealed that the brass and marble palaces of the Victorian period were less associated with drugs and dirt. I'm going to look at the roots of those problems and ask was the violence inherent in the system? And also, we're going to look towards attitudes of modernity, civic duty, sexuality, and we'll conclude, as Simon says, these problems being tackled and how they've been tackled in the last half century or so.
Dan, I don't know whether you're just trying to provide a certain level of atmosphere here. It's just that you sound as if you're talking from inside a toilet at the moment. So I don't know whether you want to. That's it. Turn your mic up. Fantastic. Thank you.
Good. Okay, I'm going to turn it off now, but let Simon take over.
Right. Okay. Let us start. This is where we should have really started before. This is the screen. This is Dan's bit on the left-hand side of the curly bit, the nice Victorian toilets with the immaculately dressed gentlemen and ladies, presumably have just taken advantage of the facilities. And I'm talking about the crap on the right-hand side, which is toilets in the 1960s, very largely. So we are going to talk about the architecture, I guess, and what went on in toilets. People just don't, as I'm sure you're very well aware, people just don't go there to go to the loo. It just seems to be lots of people do other things there. Frankly, as somebody who has spent, I can't remember the last time I went to a public loo, but it's some time, and I can't remember doing anything there apart from going to the loo. But perhaps I just lack imagination or something. But we'll be discussing all of this as we go through the lecture. More than happy to take questions and comments, of course, at the end. We look forward to your hearing about your toilet experiences. And there we are. This is what we're talking about. The 1960s is, of course, as you know, a period which is we think of it as being swinging London and all those other sort of things, but in many ways it was a sort of a link, a bridge between the past, that's the 1940s and 50s, and the sort of hairy 1970s with avocado. Um, toilet suites, and of course the decade that taste forgot. The 1960s, of course, has this great thing about being the swinging 60s pop music, young people enjoying themselves, etc., etc. My introduction to this is really, I gave my mother many years ago this book as a birthday present, and when she died about 15 years ago, we cleared out her possessions and found this immaculately untouched by her, it has to be said, although I would have thought she would have needed it on her trips to London, but who knows. And Jonathan Ralph is a great character. He's long dead, unfortunately. And I think it's a shame, really, because I'm sure he still has a lot to contribute to it. And he did several guides. The Good Loo Guide, which is the one we're really talking about tonight, and the other one, which is possibly even more interesting, is the Good Cuppa Guide. And he describes books that aspects of London have been ignored and have been ignored largely by historians. And indeed, even more importantly, I guess, he's describing a London which is beginning to disappear. The old cafes, greasy spoons are going, the old Victorian loos are closing, or being replaced by modern ones, but generally just closing. So he's describing a well that is disappearing at the time. I think to an extent he understands what's going on, but I think sometimes he really is recording stuff. And there we are. This is the first book he did, which is published in 1964. It is really a mixture of a satire on the Good Food Guide, which was formed first published in 1951, and had become by then the vade-mecum of for foodies everywhere. So if you were going out to Brighton, you would get your copy, you would work out which restaurants you go to, because you knew they're the ones that you'd get a decent meal. And also the advertising also talks about Lady Chatterley's trial, and the famous quote about would you let your servants read Lady Chatterley's lover. And of course the Good Loo Guide can be read by the servants, and it is, as a result, it is amusing. It is very amusing, even after 60 years. There's enough of it there that still provokes titillation, and an understanding of how the world has changed in that time. This is a typical example. Really, the Imperial Hotel in Russell Square. When I was young, it's famous for Peter's Bar, which is one of very few bars in London where you can still get decent beer. And now, of course, called the Russell Hotel, and home of the Russell Group of Universities, for those who are interested in that sort of thing. So, okay, just a basic description of things with a few oddities thrown in. Useful, I guess, for anybody caught short. If the guide, you could go in and you know what you to expect, but with also, as I said, quite a lot of humour. And if you go to the Turkish bars next door, long gone, of course, again, he includes that sort of humour there. So it is not just a basic guide to Loos, but it is a lot more about what he found amusing at the time. He talks largely, because he's a gentleman, about gents' loos. His wife goes and reports on ladies' loos, and they're included, as you've just seen. But ladies' loos are different, partly because, on the whole, they aren't as well maintained. I'm sure we can talk about the dialectic of this later on. And this is extract from a piece by Elizabeth Good in the Sunday Times, where he describes ladies' toilets in London, particularly at the railway stations, King's Cross and St Pancras are the ones that she really features. and again, how grim the experience was for many women at the time. And you can see why people might want to buy the Good Loo Guide, because from that you'd get some idea of the decent places to go to, the Imperial Hotel in Russell Square or wherever. So the ladies' lavatories described here are grim. And it makes quite a good story. There are a number of newspaper accounts in the 1960s of terrible conditions in Loos, and we'll come to another one later on. It's clearly on a quiet news day, you send out your cub reporter to go out and inspect the local Loos and write back on them, and of course they always come back with how dreadful it is they are. Massive observation gets involved. This is a Mrs. Williams who is employed briefly by the hotel a department store in Watford to survey the toilets in the department store to see how well they're being used, and describes with minute detail, as all good Muslims observers do, the toilets and how they were used and the facilities that were there. And it is quite interesting. She later goes on to really help build Milton Keynes, and useful little thing from the design journal. Again, you find these little things coming up. Give you builds up pictures of the toilets of the 1960s, how bad most of them were, but again, some of the innovative designs that were being discussed and being implemented at times. Each public loo, certainly, and most other loos, had an attendant, or several attendants, usually one for men, one for the ladies' loos. This is again an illustration from the cartoonist John Gratian from the Good Loo Guide of 1965 about a typical attendant. They're famous for being miserable. They're famous for being difficult to deal with, I think, and it's part because they were badly paid and the job was frankly crap, to use an analogy. Which is why you get reference to Martin Bormann, who is supposed to have been, according to Ronald Rose, the attendant at Westbourne Park toilets. Interesting, I was reading recently a history blog the other day about how Martin Bormann was thought to have come to Britain after the Second World War as a refugee. Clearly, this is just a coincidence, because Martin Bormann ended up with, we don't know what happened to Martin Bormann, but he certainly didn't come as ended up as a lavatory attendant in Westbourne Park. But it reflects the general attitudes that people had towards the attendants, and the attitudes that the tenants had towards their customers. We have an account written by one of these people, Sidney Rogers, who was a former seaman, worked in a children's home, and was approached in the early 1960s to actually become a lavatory attendant at Piccadilly Circus Loos, which is the toughest and roughest Loos in London. And he is very sympathetic to the clients, but he describes the dreadful work that he had to do in cleaning up, and the fact that he lost his sense of smell. Eventually, he gets beaten up by the police in 1968, has to retire with a burst eardrum and various other problems, and he never works again. But he manages to write this memoir of his career, most of which I have to say is not really very good, but the last chapter on his time as a lavatory attendant is priceless. Unfortunately, the book is almost impossible to obtain now, but it would be great if they could reprint it. Again, another description of the hard work the attendants have to do. They have to deal with the down and outs. You have to, you have very little support from your managers. Or the best you can do is, if you're lucky, calling the police, but that's not necessarily a good thing to do. And this is another quote from the Sunday Times in 1964. She is describing, interviews these attendants, all women, of course, women's loos, again, poorly paid, often not really able not not really able always to deal with the situation, but they're there, they have to cope as best they can with some fairly dreadful people and some fairly dreadful circumstances. Jonathan Rose talks about the loos on High Holborn, which I vaguely remember, and famously they are supposed to have had goldfish swimming in the unique Victorian water closets above. So the water would come down and you flush the toilet, the water would let out, you let more water into, and in here would live fish. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I have met people who say they've seen the fish or saw the fish, and others that say it is a myth. We don't know. But if you are interested, it's really worth watching if you get hold of the 1967 film version of London Nobody Knows, or indeed the original book that the artist Geoffrey Fletcher did in the early 60s. The film is available on YouTube, and Fletcher's book has been reprinted, I think, fairly recently, and he did a couple of dozen other books all along of similar things. Fairly nostalgic guy, pen and ink drawings of again the London Nobody Knows, a lot of which have gone subsequently. Unfortunately, became a reactionary old fool in his last few books, but there we are. Come on, let's go. Oh, there we are. What we tend to think of today, I guess, for toilets is it is a place for cottaging. When Dan and I did a talk a few months ago in Leicester, we got talking to an elderly lady who clearly had a lot of experience of this thing from her time as a youth, and saying that what we were talking about was absolutely accurate, and gave a few examples of what was going on in Leicester. And I'm sure this sort of things went on in Brighton as well. I'm sure it didn't, and you may have experienced it yourself, or people who did. Hunter Davies did a book called The New London Spy, which again is well worth getting hold of. You can often find it secondhand. Again, it's a account for swinging London, about what to expect when you come there, and the places you should go to, places you should avoid, that sort of thing. Where you can find out about accommodation, all these other sort of things that people to London in the 60s really wanted to know. And there is a section in it about the gay scene, and this is a quote from this. Again, the most famous gay man in London in probably the 1960s was Joe Orton. And again, in his diaries, he talks about visiting one of the public toilets in Holloway, North London, where he engages in this act of sex, which he violently he describes in his diaries. It's not homosexuality before 1967 was, of course, illegal. It is an easy target for the police. Cottaging went on in I suspect most of the toilets in central London and the outer skirts as well, and they turn up in newspaper accounts as the men are arrested and they're put on probation. For some cases, it's fatal for them because they're caught cottaging, and it reveals their sexual predications. And again, if they're leaving respectable lives, then they are, it is their career ending. And again, the police, as we see in Sidney Rogers has a lot of dealings with the police, not always happily, it has to be said, as I've said. And again, they come along and they're as titillated as anybody by what's going on. They say they don't like it, but clearly there is enough in the Vice Squad people in there who think it's a great laugh. They can come along, they can see what's going on, then they can go and beat these people up or arrest them or what have you. And there are a number of famous cases in the 60s. This is Lord Moynihan, who was a former chairman of the Liberal Party, and he is arrested in Piccadilly Loos at the station. He is then put on trial and he commits suicide to avoid the humiliation of being revealed as having had these undertaken these acts. What he doesn't know, of course, is that within a year, within 2 years, this would have no longer been a crime. And indeed, at the time, the House of Lords were beginning to discuss liberalisation of the homosexuality laws anyway. But of course, he can't wait that long. He has to, his family's humiliated by the publicity. What can you do? You have, the only way is to take your life. Sometimes, occasionally, people fight back. This is Mortimer Bennett, who was a senior civil servant at the Board of Trade in the early 1960s, and he's arrested at Harrow toilets. And is accused by the police. He employs Jeremy Hutchinson, who's the top QC at London at the time, as his brief. And Hutchinson takes the police to the cleaners. I'm sure there's a toilet fund we could use, but to the new paper possibly. And the police humiliate it, and they admit they hadn't seen anything. So Bennett walks free, but had he not employed Hutchinson, had he not thought his career could have ended, but he didn't, and he lives. He retires in the late 60s. He seems to have become involved with the Islington Theatre Group, and I don't know when he dies, but I can't find very much about that. But he's certainly no longer with us. The centre of all this really is Piccadilly Circus. As I say, we're remarkably lucky to have this eyewitness account by Cindy Jones. It is, of course, the centre of London. It's close to Soho, so it gets gets people from Soho coming in, going to the Loo before getting on the tube train home. You have various clubs round and about. You have Theatreland. You have everything going on, and Piccadilly Circus is the centre of it. There is a newspaper account in the People, rather sensationalist one by David Parr at the London drug scene, and again one of the quotes, he interviews a number of the attendants, and one of them says, "There's only 3 places I know of that stay open all the time: heaven, hell, and this place." And Piccadilly, as I should have said, is one of those few 24-hour loos in London at that time. And this is Jonathan Ralph's description of the Loos Piccadilly Circus, and he says, "I cannot honestly recommend these loos to the enthusiast solitaire or anywhere else. Anyone who prides himself in the loos." And he recommends various alternatives, but of course, when the pubs close or the clubs close, where else you're going to go to? You're going to go to Piccadilly Circus. It's also close to a 24-hour chemist, where you can get your fix fairly easily. For most of the 1960s, it was fairly easy to get drugs from your GP. They would give you a script, and you'd go to the boots at Piccadilly Circus, and they would hand over your heroin or whatever you wanted. It got much tougher as the 60s progressed, and of course now it's completely illegal. But in the early 1960s, really up to mid-1960s, it was pretty easy to get hold of these drugs, really. And again, where would you go to get a fix? the best place would be Piccadilly Circus, because you're opposite, very, very close to the chemist. So you'd go in there, get your fix, go to the Loos in at Piccadilly Circus, and then skin up or whatever you wanted to do in order to get your high. And there's a couple more very graphic descriptions by Sidney Rogers. And Sidney Rogers is actually very sympathetic to these people. A lot of the attendants interviewed by Stephen Farr, Daniel Farr, quoted earlier on, are very anti these people. You know, they make their lives hell. You know, they die, they vomit, they sick, they urine everywhere. The bodies are found, whatever else, or the unconscious people there. But Sidney Rogers has a real sympathy for these people, possibly through his own experience. So he is rather more sympathetic than they are, but he describes what goes on and the police reaction to it. And again, the police get their rocks away on beating these people up or humiliating them, as they do with the homosexuals. But there is a counterculture going on. This is again from the Nicholas Saunders Alternative London. Again, whether it's actually a genuine magazine, I don't know. I think it's what they call a trap street eye. He puts it in order to so if anybody rips off his text and republish it as their own, he or his publishers will know that this is a fake entry. But I think it's worth including, really. Now I'm going to pass you over to Dan.
Okay, so we've noted that there's been an increase in middle class sort of anthropological interest. They've lapped up all those reports of explorers back in civilization having ventured into darkest toilets. We've also seen how they're built as emblems of modernity, symbols of liberation from a worrisome bladder, but by the 60s, they're places of at least associated with illegal sex, dangerous delight, and of course an alleged war criminal. There's also a physical lack of toilets, lots of dirt, vandalism, and how people use facilities are no longer in line with the assumptions of the Victorian men who designed them. Here, for example, is one of the separate entrances for women. It's considered unseemly for men and women to share the same entrance areas, and often the access was down steep stairs, unsuitable for wheelchairs and prams. We can also account for the decline and fall of these toilets by addressing 3 areas of change. Ideas as how to best promote public health, views about decency, and expectations about gender roles and sexuality. Next, please. So the first Great British toilets are using a flush water system available for a penny a time. So that the exhibition, but we're not going to talk about that yet because I'm going to tell you about the Victorian terms of, oops, God. Yes, thank you. On the left, the official Victorian terms used in London. The range indicates function and assumes uses. The different toilets and their classifications kind of reflect class, gender, divisions, some of which relate to the decline and fall of the toilets. The fact that the 1960s guidebook was called the Good Loo Guide rather than, say, the crappy khazis or the shite bogs or the arseholes of the world tells us a bit about the perceived readership and their assumptions about gentility and bodily functions. So my mum would always ask, do you want to spend a penny? And perhaps you have other terms which were used in your families, or perhaps there's a local word. Anyway, I think we'll go on to the next one, Simon. So this is the provision of public toilets dates back to at least 1,700 years before Jesus, but progress from Roman sewers and urinals hasn't been smooth or even. Under medieval statutes, men and women had the right to squat in the gutter within the boundaries of the ancient city of London. In 1423, London's first mayor, Dick Whittington, establishes a 128-seat sex-segregated House of Easement hanging over the Thames. 64 seats for women, same number for men. This being Dick Whittington, of course, users had to shout out, "It's behind you," as they did a Teresa coffee and put crap into the river. London grows, greater recognition, greater regulation, and it's in the mid-19th century, particularly after the big stink of 1858, there's quite a lot of civic effort made to reduce the spread of infectious diseases by making greater public provision. So toilets, because of this shift, reflect the idea that decent provision was a sign of modernity, civilization, and progress. So the next slide tells us that The first flush system is at the 1851 exhibition. You get it for a penny. And there's a great poem, 1854, by George Young. Some marvellous rhymes, sluice, juice, news, cues. And who wouldn't want to swim through sanitary waves? Anyway, the gentlemanly Jennings in the middle is George Jennings, who charged 800,000 visitors to the exhibition a penny a time to use his halting stations or monkey closets. Having made a profit of almost £2,500, he opened the first underground public convenience in 1855, which is accessible from a tunnel from the Bank Underground station. And he argued that the civilization of people be measured by the perfection of their domestic and sanitary appliances. I'm convinced the day will come when public lavatories, replete with every convenience, will be constructed below the pavement level, not only in large towns, but in every locality where large numbers assemble. The engineer who has the courage to carry into effect a scheme of this kind in the interests of public health will have established a lasting record of the wisdom of his age. This is kind of picked up elsewhere across the empire in New Zealand in 1898. The newspaper reports, in London and other great cities, places marked for ladies only are quite usual. I fail to see, therefore, why this colony, which is New Zealand, should be 25 years behind the times. And in 1908, the Times argues, nothing so much marks a nation's progress in civilization as its attention to sanitation. Public underground conveniences are an inestimable boon to the public. It's now difficult to imagine large cities without them. Okay, thanks. Next, please. This is Holborn Underground's public conveniences. Jennings has designed this, and he's got brass handrails, white glazed bricks and tiles, enamelled slate panels in cubicles, coloured glazed brick dido walls, and ceramic urinal fixtures. It is, as a good Loo guide claims, a place of high marble stalls, ancient glass water tanks, and a polished brass attendant. Okay, I think next, please. The Good Loo Guide also refers to a very fine example of an old established English public lavatory, describing shining brass, mahogany, commemorative stone, and there's another one about Victorian sanitary treasure houses. This particular one here is the East Cheap toilet, made lots of decorative ironwork protecting the entry and alerting passengers when you see this passing by. If you see this, you know it's a toilet. And by comparison, I've put up the decorative arch where the Prime Minister lives. That's on the bottom left. So obviously, your own punchline as to where there's most crap. So the Victorians also very keen, as I suggested, to keep men and women apart. There's men's and women's separate entries at Holborn, 6 cubicles for women and 12 urinals, 8 cubicles, that's 20 units for men. And in the city, most dual-sex underground conveniences feature separate entrances. East Cheap's unusual. I think it's because of the shape of the space. But as late as 1953, there were complaints about local authority toilets where men and women were able to see one another going in. Once inside the toilets, the design reflects the ideas of Victorian men. They actually designed something called urinettes, urinals for women built by men. Some have curtains, some have doors, and some have neither. They acquire less water for flushing, and often the charge is lower, though sometimes children are charged more for wash and brush up or use of a dressing room or a mirror. These urinette things, you can see them in the picture, are soon removed, partly because the complaints are being used in an unhealthy manner with improper usage by the poorer class of women. And so support for women who are menstruating or breastfeeding is not really considered. Next, please, Simon. So here we have, well, in the mid-19th century, women out on their own were often assumed to be prostitutes. Sanctioning the construction of a toilet sanctions the idea of women being, well, footloose and fancy-free. And that kind of violates the middle-class ideals of decorum and women as static, stuffed with domestic virtue, angels in the house. And also, of course, it's argued that women have greater bodily self-discipline than men, so they can control their bodies, whilst men, frankly, can't. So perhaps the bladder was used as a sort of leash, restraining women's forays outdoors. Making the private visible was unseemly. Women's wee was really not something we should think about in public. So there's a campaign by the Ladies Sanitary Association from the 1850s who want special erections placed in a well-frequented part of the parish to provide water closet accommodation for women. And there's a campaign by George Bernard Shaw and the suffrage campaigners in the Edwardian period. Access to toilet for women rarely keeps up with that for men. And in fact, in 2019, the Royal Society of Public Health found that 40% of those who have conditions that require frequent toilet use don't leave the house. They often they're concerned about lack of facilities. And over half of the public restricts its fluid intake due to concern of the lack of toilets. And that's a strategy, of course, can have an effect on your health. So toilets for men are about management of public decency, and particularly there's concerns about immigrants, particularly rough Irishmen who are associated with drinking, rowdiness and whittling. Women, however, are seen slightly differently. They're consumers and users of the transport system. And so it's realised that if women would spend more time shopping if there's toilets, so department stores start providing restrooms for women, and they're mentioned very discreetly in adverts. And later on, hairdressers began to advertise they've got lavatories for customers. But at the same time, hotel toilets become less accessible because they want to try and exclude women from respectful hotels. That's a bit, hiring the rooms by the hour is a bit dodgy. Men can use toilets in pubs and clubs, women can't. Railway companies began to provide waiting rooms and toilets, but these are only for travellers. So in general, women, if not in work outside the home, left home with less opportunities for toilets than men, and they travelled shorter distances. You can see this in other places. In Dunedin, in New Zealand, the first council lavvy was on the beach. And that's because the council also ran the trams, and they realised if they got women to use the trams to go to the beach, then they'd make more money all around. So those kind of divisions between men and women's attitudes towards them begin to dissolve by the 1960s, and they leave the toilets as kind of fit for an earlier age. Okay, Simon. So this is about clothing, I think, next. Men have got buttons, zips, that's easy access for whittling. Women's long dresses mean good news, you can whittle so nobody can see you if you're a Victorian. Victorians also wore skirts and petticoats, and then there's actually something called a cage crinoline from the 1850s. And the bad news is lace stays, which put pressure on the bladder, but they also tended to wear drawers, which are kind of two cylindrical leg coverings attached to a waistband, but open at the crotch. One of Havelock Ellis's earliest memories is of once accompanying the nurse who was wheeling the perambulator with the baby. Nurse stood still, and I heard a mysterious sound as of a stream of water descending to the earth. We will come back to Havelock and his interest in women's whittling. But at the end of the 1860s, fewer undergarments are worn, drawers remained open, gradually skirts narrow until the Edwardian period, 20th century. They're still quite long. Hemlines go up after 1912 to 25, and during the First World War, women literally wear the trousers. By the 1920s, there's closed drawers, or I think we can call them knickers, and rising hemlines, so less easy to wee discreetly in public. And the rationale for toilets has shifted by the time we get to the miniskirt. Okay, Simon, next one, please. So this has got quite a lot going on here. This is Alec Guinness, and that's Mrs. Sybil Neville Rolfe. Havelock Ellis again, hooray. Some film posters and a urinal in Brixton, which is pretty much similar to the one I'm going to mention in a court case. So there's really 3 points going on here. Between 1533 and 1861, that's quite a long period, the punishment for sodomy was death, and then minimum of 10 years hard labour. 1885, homosexuality becomes a crime. 1898, Vagrancy Act, that revised in 1912, establishes mandatory sentences in prison for male sexual solicitation of other men, whether cash is involved or not, and flogging for a second offence. Toilets become, nevertheless, sites for sex between men, which is very difficult to find anywhere else. During the First World War, there's a sort of protective and romantic feelings between some soldiers, which you can read out in the poetry, but the military code mandates prison sentences for homosexual acts up to 10 years minimum. You can get life for anal intercourse and 2 years for oral sex. And something like 22 officers and 270 soldiers are court-martialed for sodomy. And this concern about homosexuality leads to greater vigilance in toilets. So just after the First World War, 1922-27, 80 men are arrested per year in London for homosexual solicitation. 1927, there's a famous cricketer called Frank Bateman Champion who's arrested, charged in a toilet just like the one we're showing here. The man who accuses him is a copper who, between 1926 and 1927, this particular policeman, Constable Hanford, had been involved in 54 cases at Bow Street police station. 31 is the only witness, and 12 of these were importuning of male persons by persons. So this cricketer, Bateman champion, got 3 months with hard labour, but he appeals and gets off. At which point, the Home Office starts looking into, dodgy police malpractice, and the number of incidents falls, or at least ones resulting in criminal prosecutions. But still, urinals account for between 55 and 70% of the total of prosecutions. Nevertheless, the number of arrests falls. It's 15 in 1928, 10 in 1929, and then, hooray, Mrs. Sybil Neville Rolfe, who's the founder of the Eugenics Education Society, insists the police keep spying. In the 1930s, 113 arrests, that's gone up from 10 the year before, for homosexual acts in London, and is similar for the rest of the decade in the 30s. And most of the arrests, half of them, are made in just 9 public urinals in the West End. Okay, next slide, please. So whilst all this is going on, this is Paul Pry's book, which is called For Your Convenience, a learned dialogue instructive to all Londoners and London visitors, overheard in the Fellow May Club, taken down verbatim. Now, Paul Pry is, in fact, Thomas Burke, and he writes this in 1937, just when everybody's being arrested. This is the arrest map on the other side. It's a police raids map, actually. So we're going to move on from this, please. Next, to the map on the inside of the book. It's published by Routledge. Now, it's quite a respectable, long-standing publisher. Are they in on the joke? I don't know. There are symbols. Buckingham Palace is shown as a crown, the zoo is an elephant, and the Wallace collection is a painter's palace. They're sort of pavilions, and I was going to call them jousting tents, but that would be a bit camp. They're toilets, where 2 knights come together wielding their erect lances. And there's 2 lavatory attendants brandishing toilet brushes. They're sort of seen reclining in the foreground. These are muscular men with a sort of six-pack, which is often seen on Grecian statues. This is on the front page of this book by Pry, and it also, the very front page actually, has this picture of the bloke with the curled brolly between his legs, which is a sort of clue to what the book is really about. And on page 4, we learn that St. Christopher's Place has an engaging passage at the middle. In a cul-de-sac at the end of that passage, you'll have found full service. Cromwell Road, it's asked, has any London explorer reached its penetratia, discovered what lurks in its ducky curves? And one of the characters in the book, there's only 2 having a conversation, adds, museums of the Cromwell Road district are useful retreats. So it's sort of hiding in plain sight. It's a gay guide, but they're not calling it that because it would be slightly illegal. Anyway, that's in 1937. War breaks out shortly afterwards. And during the first 12 months of the war, 48 men are court-martialed for indecency between males. And the last 12 months, it goes up to 324. So during the war, there are more men court-martialed for homosexual acts than any other category of offence. And the arrest rate rises after the Second World War. So in 1938, 134 cases of sodomy, 52, 670, 54, 1,043. And the arrests for homosexuality also goes up pretty similarly. The Director of Public Prosecutions, 1944 to 64, makes the suppression of homosexuality a primary goal of law enforcement. There's targets, there's training courses in entrapment, and some police take this very seriously. Hertfordshire police remove the floorboards from the main floor of the town hall. They can spy on the toilets below. And the number of cases of gross indecency zooms up. There's a few famous cases. 53, John Gielgud fined a tenner for soliciting sex. 1959, male prostitution of street soliciting by both men and women becomes illegal. 1962, Wilfred Bramble, who's steptoe and son famous, he's arrested in the Shepherd's Bush toilet for persistently importuning for an immoral purpose. He gets to pay 25 guineas. Simon said the Sexual Offences Act 1967 decriminalises homosexual acts in England and Wales between 2 adult men in private, except for the armed services. Nevertheless, the association between toilets and illegality remains. And Another element of this, oh, thank you, is that sex in toilets is deemed to be unhealthy. So same-sex enthusiasm, interest was kind of benign until the 19th century. In the 19th century becomes kind of medicalized. That's until the 1960s. The 1952 Handbook for Healthcare Professionals, which is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, calls homosexuality sociopathic personality disturbance. 1968, it's classified as a sexual deviance along with paedophilia. It's only in 1973 that homosexuality is removed from this book. The other association is with treachery. So in the First World War, a bloke called Roger Casement was executed for treason, but his diaries are leaked and his homosexuality and treason are linked. In 1918, there's a politician independent called Noel Pemberton Billing. He claims in his newspaper, which is called Imperialist, though it later becomes Vigilante, that the Germans have knowledge of a black book with the names of 47,000 men and women homosexuals, and they're going to use this data to gain military information. 1940s, there's loads of stuff in the newspapers about homosexuality being incompatible with national security, and that film clip, the film I mentioned, showed you earlier, Graham Greene's Ministry of Fear. The book comes out in 1943, the film a year later. The toilet is where homosexuality and spy identities are portrayed as discreet, criminal, outside the norm. Noel Coward, who actually was a spy in the Second World War, recruits Alex Guinness in a toilet. There's loads of double entendres. 1951, Burgess and McLean are two homosexuals, spies, they defect to the USSR. 1952, there's some fresh policy to sack homosexuals from sensitive government positions. Blunt and Burgess, who are known to have engaged in anonymous sexual cruising in public toilets. Next year, there's a bloke called William Vassell. He's been blackmailed by the Russians and he's provided secret information. He's arrested in 1962, got 18 years. So the reason for the decline from those sort of lovely cherubs on pipework to the broken, rancid, graffiti-ridden, unsafe crime scenes which Simon showed you is because the focus of public health had shifted. Instead of wanting people to have a decent place to wee, the authorities encouraged all homes to have indoor facilities and tried to deter illegal drug use, gay encounters, and mostly public spending. Okay, Simon. Oh, is it or me, in fact, in this case? No. Oh, clearly yes. So there is a concern about the loss of public toilets, and it's just expressed in, there's a greater interest in the greater concern begins to rise about the lack of toilets going around. And one of the reasons for this is that not only are they, once they're closed, they are reopened in a variety of different ways. Next, please. Oh,
Right.
she's
Coming to me.
yes.
You can see this has immaculately been rehearsed. Right. Okay. This is again. We've mentioned Holborn earlier on, and this is where it was. It closed in the 1970s. I vaguely remember I must have gone to it at some stage, I guess, possibly, and it's now buried under the main road. They cleared most of that house, most of that area, and built some rather grim 70s buildings there. And I'm afraid the Loos were a victim of this. But then again, I guess Camden Council probably wouldn't have wanted to have kept them open. They probably couldn't afford to do so, and there probably relatively few people were using them anyway. This is how we like to think of our Loos, as being immaculately clean and full of very nice tiling and whatever else. But the reality, I fear, is often too very different, as we've seen in a number of the slides, that they're very poorly maintained, and as a result, people didn't go to them because they didn't feel safe, or they were worried about public hygiene. There are a number, half a dozen listed Loos. the ones that I know best, at least because I go to the Lamb pub quite often, which is quite close to the one in Guildford Street, that is closed as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure it's listed, but you can't get access to it. I don't know about the others, but again, there are a number that have been listed. Whether there are any listed outside London, I don't know, but it's possible they are. And if there's a nice Loos in Brighton, then it's worth trying to get them listed if they're not already listed, because they are a part of life that is going, has gone in many ways, and it's something we just don't think about until they've gone, really. That a lot of them, as Dan has shown, they were very attractive architecturally and encouraged, because they were part of urban civic pride in the late 19th century. You build the town halls, you build the public loos, you eventually get round to building council housing for the workers, but you start off, one of the things you can do early on is by building attractive toilets. Again, those that haven't been demolished or covered over might be change of use. This is a picture of the internet showing how a toilet was converted into housing. Think of your own pun here, I guess, possibly. Others are turned into clubs and other bars and that sort of thing. And there was a fashion a few years ago to do this, which I'm sure was very witty, but again, there is a demand still for these toilets, and even turn into homes, bars, hotels, even, I guess, possibly, and other things as well. So they are, you can sometimes see them around, even though that they're no longer listed. And this is one again, disused underground at Rosebery Avenue. Again, obviously a public toilet, obviously closed for many, many years. I don't know when it closed, presumably in the 1960s, but for one reason or another, they haven't demolished it, and they've just left it as a sort of a memorial, really, to public loos of the past. And it's a great shame, really, that they aren't still being used or turned into other things. But we talked about homosexuality, we talked about cottaging, we've talked about actually going to the toilet, but there are other uses made of toilets, and a quick trawl through the British Newspaper Archive comes up with some examples for Brighton. Again, somebody in 1903 steals pennies from the boxes that you put your penny in to go to loo, hence Dan's phrase, "Go spending a penny." This is what you would do, and this is what Charles William Cross, age 53, stole a shilling's worth of 12 pence worth of pennies from a box in toilet. He must have been really desperate to do that, but there we are. And the other thing I come up with, which I quite like, is that teenagers are caught drinking illegally bottles of Bass in a toilet on Grand Junction Road in Brighton. Again, this is the sort of thing that went on. Toilets are used, of course, obviously for other things. It is, as Dan suggests, really, it's where things that in society you can't do anywhere else, you can do it or could have done in toilets back in the day. So again, this talk is largely about London, but it's important to stress that London is not unique. So if you're interested in the history of toilets in Brighton or anywhere else, newspapers are a brilliant source for finding stuff, because at least if nothing else, the events will be recorded in the police blotter, in court reports, or indeed often in council minutes when they're discussing building loos or closing loos, for that matter. So again, newspapers are a great source, and London is not unique in what was going on. What you tend not to get outside London is the cases of cottaging and the rest of homosexuals. I've not found very many trawling through the papers.
Right. Well, it's not all doom and gloom.
Oh yes, it is.
Because disposal of poo and wee might seem true for all time and everywhere, and even everybody has to crap. But where and how we go is down to society. So the six things I want to we've seen, an idea of women's purity and ability to control themselves results in toilets where men behave decently and considerately, and less provision for women who are encouraged to remain at home. But the change has been that there's been campaigns for something called pequality. The penny has dropped and there's a pequal, a pop-up facility. Its makers claim no funnels are involved and it's semi-private. You can't see anything from the waist down. And it's the UK's first touch-free women's urinal. They're designed for outdoor events in mine festivals and the like, and it's said that the process of going to the toilet is 6 times quicker than compared to conventional portaloo. A flat pack made from 100% recyclable materials, apparently it's all there. There's also a sort of Scandinavian avian version called the Lappi, with a pink spiral design, created by a French person. And the second point we've kind of thought about is how we've seen department stores provided restrooms to encourage women to shop and they promoted decorous feminine behaviour. But today, attitudes towards how women should behave have shifted. Many women's toilets have condom machines, Tampax machines, adverts, in some cases toothbrushes, and advice if you spot people being trafficked, or if you are being trafficked. And the third point is about how we've seen men and women separated from any leisure and workplace activities. So it used to be the case in the Masonic Lodge or the WI, but we also needed to have separate entrances to their toilets. Today, we're virtually all sitting together. And in 2022, government decided that all new public buildings must have separate single-sex toilets to reduce the number of gender-neutral facilities. We've also seen how people with a range of access issues, notably the disabled and young children, have been excluded. And today, it's claimed, I should say, the latest train toilets apparently are going to have changing tables in every toilet, a pull-down seat to secure toddlers, a pull-out rack to store bags just above the level of suspiciously wet floors, and an information screen by the mirror, which will update you on how slowly you're going. About 300,000 people became disabled because of the Second World War. And this is my bottom right picture. So 1963 sees the publication of a polio survivors book by a bloke called Selwyn Goldsmith, and he writes, Designing for the Disabled. And eventually by 1995, there's legislation which was introduced to ensure that all public buildings are accessible and had suitable facilities. So there's a shift there. And the fifth area perhaps has been, we've seen how civic pride has shifted from its focus. It used to be the case that these were going to be palaces, underground palaces, but now that the people who pay the rates or the council taxes have easy access to toilets at home or in their workplaces, there's less interest. And in 2020, the MP for North Norfolk contributed to the non-domestic rating public lavatories bill, and he said that public lavatories should not pay rates. He didn't think this was. He thought it was a great idea. They should not pay. He gave a whole speech in Parliament about public about this. A great relief. He said his idea wasn't potty and so forth. You can imagine. Public lavatories are a lifeline. Access to a lavatory is not just a nicety; it's a fundamental, basic human right. So this MP, at that time, the council in Norfolk had 39 toilets, and it was costing them £700,000 a year. And he praised them all, and he was a Conservative MP. So I'm just waiting for somebody to come up with the line about the only good Tory not being a lavatory. We've seen how cleanliness was not prioritised, but today, recently, the UN has declared as an International Year of Sanitation, and there's 17 states signed up to the World Toilet Organization, which is headquartered in Singapore, and these changes reflect, I think, change since the 1960s. So I think we'll have the next slide, please. Yeah, this is new technology. That kind of grey lump on the right, that's an automated toilet. You may have come across these. They're not cleaned by they are cleaned by humans, but only they pop in on servicing visits. There's nobody behind a little counter. They're often privately owned. They're available with advertising space and sales points. They've got blue lighting, so you can't find your veins when you want to inject. Actually, it makes it more difficult for the elderly, visually impaired, autistic people, anybody who wants to inject drugs for medical purposes like diabetes. They're also designed to be unacceptable for adults to be able to easily wash and clean themselves. There's no changing table. There's limited space. There's a sort of weight detector. So the idea is that children can't wander in and be trapped, but it's also designed to stop multiple occupancy. There's lots of prevention measures. They're aimed at stopping drug use, but they have unintended consequences for disabled people. So there's shelf spaces are necessary if you've got a colostomy bag, but they've been removed to make it impossible to crush up drugs on it. Doors open after 15 minutes, which, well, if you means using toilets for sex makes it a bit more exposed, but also it's the system's dysfunctional if this door is held open. Stainless steel doors and toilets which close automatically after a certain time prevent people from sleeping there, of course. So what I think is going on is we're being infantilized with toilets out of our control. You can't decide how much soap is dispensed, when to flush, how long the tap runs. Standardized helpings of paper, and no more than 3 helpings per trip. Even the hot air blown in your hands is rationed. So I think this is where things are moving, but it's not necessarily in the direction we want to go. Anyway, I'm going to let Simon carry on at his convenience.
And this is the direction we've come into almost the end of the presentation, but I don't think you can't go without talking about station loos, because they've been an important part of the loo going places going to the loos for since really the 1830s. I don't know whether the earliest loo was built for the railways, but pretty early on. Generally regarded as being fairly disgusting. There used to be a lot on the underground. Virtually every station had a loo in the 1970s, but they all went. So in the 1960s, Jonathan Rouse talks about some of them, but most of them have gone in the close to the 1960s. The London Transport said that most people now have easy access to loos at home, or there are other places they could go to. So there are not very many in central London, but a recent paper before the Greater London Assembly forced a promise from the London Transport that they would be building more loos or reopening old ones across the whole of the network to allow people to use loos on stations. I have not seen much evidence of that to date, certainly not in central London, but there are still loos at many stations around the capital and underground stations and elsewhere. Ralph and other people talk about the loos, new loos at Victoria, which I think now have gone. It opened in 1966 as being the future. He says it's one of the only benefit to beaching is that they managed to open a new loo at Victoria. Under privatisation, the railways started charging, Network Rail started charging for loos, immensely unpopular move. It's a psychological thing, really. Most people can afford 20p or 50p to go to loo. It's a psychological thing, not refusing to pay that. Now, most of the stations in London now have free loos. This is a model for a new loo at I can't remember which station it is now. I think it's Victoria again. How they'll be building new loos that are light, easy to maintain, and pleasant to go to. So we're coming to the end of our presentation. As I say, more than happy to take questions and comments. This is some of the sources that we've used in our presentation. There's a lot more that we could have included. Our plan is eventually, once we can agree on a research question, is to have to write a book about the subject.